I went through this experience 2 years ago. It was a little after midnight. I had only been living in that house for a few days, but sleep just wouldn't come. Maybe it was the unease of settling into a new town, or maybe it was the endless sound of the rain. I was sitting in the living room, the lamp dimmed low, listening to the silence. And then, I caught a strange noise. Those steady metallic sounds echoing from the side. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was coming from my neighbor David's garage. He's probably fixing some old machine, I told myself. But the rhythm and the persistence of it felt like something far beyond a simple repair. First, the scraping sounds, like shoveling into the earth. Then heavy thuds, as if something was striking concrete. Over and over, non-stop. Curious, I stepped toward the window. I pulled the curtain slightly aside. In the dim glow of the garage, I could see David's outline, his shoulders hunched forward, as if he was pounding something into the ground, then dragging it across. For a second, he lifted his head. Our eyes met. My body froze. That expression, not fear, not surprise. It was more like a grim determination. I quickly snapped the curtain shut and backed away, shivering. I whispered to myself, "Forget it, don't get involved. Maybe he's just fixing his car," but deep down, my heart was screaming something else. Minutes later, after our eyes had locked, a loud knock hit my door. I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. I crept slowly to the door. I peered through the peephole. David. Rainwater ran down his hair. He was covered in mud. His face looked calm, but that same unsettling determination lingered in his eyes. "Can I use your phone?" he asked, like it was the most ordinary favor. "I need to make an urgent call. I'll give it right back." My throat tightened. Without thinking, I blurted, "I'm afraid not." And I quickly slammed the door shut. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath. Minutes ticked by. Just as my nerves began to settle, the doorbell rang again. This time, not loud or forceful, but soft, yet insistent. I looked through the peephole again. He held a small flashlight in his hand. He was waving the beam back and forth, almost like it was some kind of game. He was smiling, but something in that smile felt terribly wrong. "Come on, just a minute," he said. His tone was unsettling, half cheerful, half tense. "I'll bring it right back." I promise I held my breath. I didn't answer. I just listened. After a long pause, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy. Then, the garage door slammed shut. The screech of metal echoed through the rain and shook me to the core. After a while, the sounds outside faded. The dragging noises grew weaker and finally disappeared. Gathering my courage, I pulled the curtain slightly open. Through the rain, I spotted strange shapes half buried in the mud. The yard was scattered with dug-up holes, as if the ground had been torn apart. Something had been dragged there, but I had no idea what. Seeing those marks in the yard left me with only one thought. I needed to run, but where? I had just moved into this town. I didn't know a soul. My car was parked in a small garage across the street, but to get there, I would have to pass directly in front of David's house. My legs trembled. I shut the curtains again and collapsed onto the living room couch. I sat there for what felt like forever. Sleep was impossible. It felt as if something unseen was moving quietly through the house. Finally, I made up my mind. I would go upstairs to the bedroom. Maybe I'd feel just a little safer there. I turned off the light and crept up the stairs. As soon as I entered the bedroom, I closed the door and leaned against the wall. My chest was pounding, but at least I was upstairs. In the dark, I lay down on the bed, listening to the rain hammering outside. I pulled the blanket tightly over me. I tried to close my eyes, but my thoughts kept circling back to David's gaze. That look, a determination that pierced through you, like someone who would stop at nothing to finish what he started. Just as my eyes were beginning to close, a sudden crash startled me. Glass shattered. The sharp crack cut through the sound of the rain, silencing everything else. I shot up. My hands trembled. I fought the panic rising in my chest. Only one thought came to mind: build a barricade. I locked the bedroom door, then dragged the chairs, the small table, and the nightstand in front of it as fast as I could. My palms were slick with sweat, but I didn't stop. All I wanted was to make the door hold. Then I dialed the police immediately. I thought I heard footsteps. Then a low humming sound rose in the distance. At first, it was drowned out by the rain, but as it grew closer, red and blue lights flashed through the window. Downstairs, the police forced the doors open and moved through the house. I was still crouched in the dark corner of my bedroom. Slowly, I pushed the barricade aside and cracked the door open, and then I heard it. From the bathroom. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when the beam of light swung that way, they saw him, curled up inside, hiding in the shadows. He still had the small flashlight in his hand, its light flickering on and off. His expression hadn't changed at all. No fear, no shame. Only that same cold, fixed determination. The house was a wreck. Drawers yanked open, furniture overturned, and outside, the dug-up holes and dragging marks still haunted my vision. The police inspected the disturbed soil, but never told me what they found. That night, I lay in the bedroom and shut my eyes, but deep down I knew I would never forget what happened. Last summer, after one of the most exhausting stretches of my life, I decided I had to get away from the city. My days all blurred together. I'd go to work in the mornings, return worn out at night, and spend the weeks dissolving in front of a glowing computer screen. The noise, the traffic, the never-ending hurry. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Eventually, only one thought remained. I needed to leave. A few days to rest would probably do me good. A friend told me about an old cabin for rent, way back in the woods. It has electricity, but no phone reception, he said. That appealed to me. It was exactly what I wanted. Silence felt like a luxury, so I made the reservation. When I set off in my car, the sky was overcast. Yet I felt a relief I couldn't explain. As the city fell away behind me, the roads narrowed down to single lanes. Buildings gave way to thickening trees. The sky darkened with heavy gray clouds. Soon the rain began. At first it was a thin veil. Then thunder rolled and a downpour started. I reached the cabin in the afternoon. When I pulled up at the top of the slope, the first thing I noticed was moss hanging from the eaves and tiles gone missing. The wooden walls had bowed to damp, and the hinges were coated with rust. From the outside, it looked like it had been left empty for years. But when I opened the door and stepped inside, I was taken aback. There was no dust. The floors had been swept and the furniture arranged. There was a small sitting room, 2 bedrooms, and at the back, a locked storage room. That day, I was too tired to think much. I put down my bag, lit the fire, and let the warmth sink in. The rain never stopped its steady tapping outside. On the roof, the windows, the ground, it kept the same steady rhythm. I read for a while, then lay down on the bed. Around midnight, just as my eyes were closing, I heard a noise. A sound that seemed to come from deep inside, like metal being dragged. At first I assumed it was an animal. Maybe something old had toppled in the yard. But the sound did not stop. On the contrary, it sharpened. as if something heavy was being hauled. My whole body tightened. Then I realized the sound came from the locked storage room behind me. The scrape of metal followed by a muffled roar like something large being dragged through mud. It rose and fell with the rain's rhythm. It sounded as if someone were hauling iron across the ground. My hand shook as I picked up the lantern from the bedside table. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment. I wondered if I should go. I told myself again and again, it's probably the wind, maybe loose metal. But something inside told me it wasn't that. The rain still poured. When I opened the door, the cold air struck my face. The smell of wet earth and the bite of damp leaves stung my throat. The lantern's beam was faint in the rain. I stepped carefully, puddles splashing underfoot, my voice swallowed by the night. As I neared the shed, the sound stopped. In that instant, the silence felt heavier than the storm. I halted a few paces away. I trained the lantern on the door. One hinge was black with rust, and mud had been splattered beneath the threshold. Everything looked ordinary, until I noticed the shadows. For a moment, I saw movement beneath the door. My hand went to the door, then froze. My mind screamed, "Don't touch it." Still, that strange curiosity, an urge I couldn't explain, pushed me forward. I set my hand on the rusty lock. It seemed as if it hadn't been opened in years. I pressed, and it squealed as it opened. Inside it was pitch black. Boxes were stacked in a tumble, old belongings tucked into corners. I shone the flashlight inside. Dusty shelves, an old stovepipe, frayed ropes. It all looked ordinary. Just as I stepped back, something moved. Someone stepped out from between the boxes. A man. He was drenched. Mud-caked shoes and a sodden shirt clung to him. When his face came into the beam, my throat clenched. He stared at me with cold eyes. He said nothing. The chill in his gaze spoke louder than any words. Silently, he started to walk toward me with heavy, measured steps. I backed away. My heart felt like it would burst through my ribs. His hands were empty, but there was an odd purpose in the way he looked. The lantern trembled in my grasp. Summoning a sudden surge of courage, I hurled it among the boxes. The light spun and cast frantic shadows on the walls. For a sliver of a moment, the man turned toward the glow. I seized that instant and ran. Slipping through the mud in the rain, I sprinted for the cabin. I slammed the door behind me and shot the bolt home. My breath pounded in the little hut. It mixed with the roar of the rain. My hands would not stop shaking. He was still there. Outside the door, I heard the squeak of his boots in the mud. The steps came closer, then receded, then advanced again. It felt as if he circled the cabin. I didn't dare peek behind the curtain. Even if I had tried, I couldn't have seen through the dark, smeared with rain. Still, I knew he was there. Hours slipped by. The rain finally ceased. Birds began to sing from deep in the woods. Morning arrived. When the sun came up, I grabbed my bag. I left the cabin without looking back. As my feet sank into the mud on the path, my only thought was to put as much distance between us as possible. But I couldn't shake the feeling as I walked away. It was like a pair of eyes still watching from the dark windows of that silent cabin I had abandoned. It was the last days of November. That evening, when the rain began, the city seemed darker than usual. The yellow light from the street lamps struggled to reach the ground, as if fighting through the fog. The air was heavy, the sky threatening, and the wind was like a ghost wandering the wet sidewalks. At that hour, when people hurried home, shutters were quickly lowered, and curtains were tightly closed. Being on the street was not a matter of courage, but of necessity. That's precisely why every step I took until I reached home deepened the loneliness that was settling over me. It was actually an ordinary day for me. Work fatigue, the stifling rush of the crowd, and an inner turmoil that wouldn't subside. But I didn't know that what would happen that night would fall upon me like a shadow I would never forget for the rest of my life. When I entered the house, it was as if all the fatigue of the day would remain behind the door, along with the water dripping from me. I took off my coat and turned on the lights. The house was quiet. The downpour outside made that silence even heavier. I sat on the couch for a while, just listening to the sound of the rain. It was as if the outside world was drowning. This part of town was usually quiet in the evenings, but tonight felt a little different. I don't know if it was the heaviness in the air or the weariness inside me. There was an indescribable uneasiness inside me. As time passed, I began to feel as if the walls of the house were closing in on me. As midnight approached, I was getting ready for bed when the doorbell suddenly rang. That short, ding-dong sound disrupted my heartbeat. I stood there frozen for a few seconds. I walked cautiously toward the door. My steps seemed to sink heavily into the carpet. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. I waited a few more seconds. Then I slowly opened the door. In front of me was only an empty street, a gray landscape where raindrops hit the asphalt and scattered. I stretched my head out, looked left and right. No one was there. When I returned inside, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a mistake or a childish prank. But seeing that emptiness in front of the door somehow made me feel even more uneasy. I went back to my bed. I had just slipped under the covers when my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen, an unknown number. The message was short and frightening. I rang your doorbell but couldn't find you. My eyes froze on the screen. I read the message over and over. Who was this? And why were they sending me such a message? My heart was pounding wildly as I clutched my phone. I told myself it was a bad joke. I didn't recognize the number, and I didn't want to reply. But my mind couldn't shake the image of someone not at the door and the coldness of the message. My eyes were starting to close when I heard a sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but a few seconds later, the sound repeated. This time it was much clearer. The door handle was moving. I could clearly hear someone trying to open the door from outside. My breath caught. I got out of bed quietly, grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking as I pressed the call button. When I got through to the police line, my voice came out low and trembling. Someone's trying to force my door open. Please hurry. Before I could finish my sentence, the door began to shake. That loud noise, mixed with the sound of rain, echoed throughout the house. Someone was really trying to get in. I ended the call. I clutched my phone tightly so I wouldn't drop it. I crouched in the corner of my room and waited. The minutes dragged on. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it would burst out of my chest. Then I heard sirens in the distance. That familiar sound was the only thing that allowed me to breathe. The forcing at the door suddenly stopped. Then I heard footsteps quickly receding into the rain. A few minutes later, the police arrived at the door. Hearing their voices, all my muscles relaxed. I opened the door, my face still frozen with fear. As they checked the house and secured it, an announcement came over the radio. The suspect was apprehended 2 blocks away. A strange emptiness settled inside me at that moment. I didn't know who it was. Even his capture didn't reassure me. Because my real question was, why had he chosen me? While the police were examining the area, I stood by the door, barefoot and half shivering. I thought to myself, I wish I hadn't turned on the lights. Maybe they had seen me. Maybe I had been watched for a long time. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time there was thunder, I flinched and looked at the window. I forced my eyes shut, afraid I'd see a shadow behind the curtain. In the morning, I was called to the police station. I wanted to know the suspect's identity, but they didn't tell me anything specific to my face. He may have chosen you by chance, they said. But that message, I rang your doorbell but couldn't find you. Could that have been a coincidence? From that moment on, my life began to change. Every unfamiliar face on the street, every person sitting next to me on the bus, every customer passing by me in the market felt like a threat. My hand trembled with every notification on my phone. And worst of all, that unknown number was still silent. It didn't send another message.